Chapter 11. There were these things to do. He transferred all the eggs from the small beach into the shelter, reburying them near his sleeping area. It took all his will to keep from eating another one as he moved them, but he got it done, and when they were out of sight again, it was easier. He added wood to the fire and cleaned up the camp area. A good laugh, that, cleaning up the camp. All he did was shake out his windbreaker and hang it in the sun to dry the berry juice that had soaked in, and smooth the sand where he slept. But it was a mental thing. He had gotten depressed, thinking about how they hadn't found him yet, and when he was busy, he had something to do, the depression seemed to leave. So, there were things to do. With the camp squared away, he brought in more wood. He decided to always have enough on hand for 3 days. After spending one night with the fire for a friend, he knew what a staggering amount of wood it would take. He worked all through the morning at the wood, breaking down dead limbs and breaking or chopping them into smaller pieces, storing them neatly beneath the overhang. He stopped once to take a drink at the lake, and in his reflection, he saw that the swelling in his head was nearly gone. There was no pain there, so he assumed that it had taken care of itself. His leg was also back to normal, although he had a small pattern of holes, roughly star-shaped, where the quills had nailed him, and while he was standing at the lakeshore taking stock, he noticed that his body was changing. He'd never been fat, but he had been slightly heavy, with a little extra weight just above his belt at the sides. This was completely gone, and his stomach had caved in to the hunger, and the sun had cooked him past burning, so he was tanning, and with the smoke from the fire, his face was starting to look like leather. But perhaps more than his body was the change in his mind, or the way he was becoming. I'm not the same, he thought. I see, I hear differently. He didn't know when the change started, but it was there. When a sound came to him now, he didn't just hear it, but would know the sound. He would swing and look at it, a breaking twig, a movement of air, and know the sound as if he somehow could move his mind back down to the wave of sound to the source. He could know what the sound was before he quite realized he had heard it, and when he saw something, a bird moving a wing inside a bush or a ripple on the water, he would truly see that thing. Not just notice it, as he used to notice things in the city. He would see all the parts of it, see the whole thing, the whole wing, the feathers, see the color of the feathers, see the bush, and the size and shape and color of its leaves. He would see the way the light moved with the ripples on the water, and see that the wind made the ripples, and which way that wind had to blow to make the ripples move in that certain way. None of that used to be in Brian, and now it was part of him, a changed part of him, a grown part of him, and the two things, his mind and his body, had come together as well, had made a connection with each other that he didn't quite understand. When his ears heard a sound or his eyes saw a sight, his mind took control of his body. Without his thinking, he moved to face the sound or the sight, moved to make ready for it, to deal with it. There were these things to do. When the wood was done, he decided to get a signal fire ready. He moved atop of the rock ridge that comprised the bluff over his shelter and was pleased to find a large flat stone area. More wood, he thought, moaning it inwardly. He went back to the fallen trees and found more dead limbs, carrying them up on the rock until he had enough for a bonfire. Initially, he thought of making a signal fire every day, but he couldn't. He would never be able to keep the wood supply going. So, while he was working, he decided to have a fire ready, and if he heard an engine, or even thought he heard a plane engine, he would run up with a burning limb and set off a signal fire. Things to do. At the last trip to the top of the stone bluff with wood, he stopped, sat on the point overlooking the lake, and rested. The lake lay before him, 20 or so feet below, and he'd not seen it this way since he'd come down with the plane. Remembering the crash, he had a moment of fear, a breath-tightening little rip of terror, but it passed, and he was quickly caught in the beauty of the scenery. It was so incredibly beautiful that it was almost unreal. From his height, he could not just see the lake, but across part of the forest, a green carpet, and it was full of life, birds, insects. There was a constant hum and song. At the other end of the bottom of the L, there was another large rock sticking out over the water, and on top of the rock, a snaggly pine had somehow found food and grown, bent and gnarled. Sitting on one limb was a blue bird with a crest and a sharp beak, a kingfisher. He thought of a picture he'd seen once, which left the branch while he watched and dove into the water. It emerged a split second part of a second later. In its mouth was a small fish, wiggling silver in the sun. It took the fish to a limb, juggled it twice, and swallowed it whole. Fish. Of course, he thought. There were fish in the lake, and they were food. And if a bird could do it... He scrambled down to the edge of the bluff and trotted to the edge of the lake, looking down into the water. Somehow, it had never occurred to him to look inside the water, only at the surface. The sun was flashing back up into his eyes, and he moved off to the side and took his shoes off and waded out 15 feet. Then he turned and stood still, with the sun at his back, and studied the water again. It was, he saw after a moment, literally packed with life. Small fish swam everywhere, some narrow and long, some round, most of them 3 or 4 inches long, some a bit larger, and many smaller. There was a patch of mud off to the side, leading into the deeper water, and he could see old clam shells there, so there must be clams. As he watched, a crayfish, looking like a tiny lobster, left one of the empty clam shells and went to another, looking for something to eat, digging with its claws. While he stood, some of the small, roundish fish came quite close to his legs, and he tensed, got ready, and made a wild stab at grabbing one of them. They exploded away in 100 flicks of quick light, so fast he had no hope of catching them that way. But soon they came back, seemed to actually be curious about him, and as he walked from the water, he tried to think of a way to use that curiosity to catch them. He had no hooks or string, but if he could somehow lure them into the shallows and make a spear, a small fish spear, he might be able to strike fast enough to get one. He would have to find the right kind of wood, slim and straight. He had seen some willows up along the lake that might work, and he could use the hatchet to sharpen it and shape it while he was sitting by the fire tonight. And that brought up the fire, which he had to feed again. He looked at the sun and saw it was getting late in the afternoon, and when he thought of how late it was, he thought he ought to reward all his work and eat another egg, and that made him think of that some kind of dessert would be nice. He smiled when he thought of dessert, so fancy, and he wondered if he should move up the lake and see if he could find some raspberries after he banked the fire. And while he was looking for the right wood for a spear wood, he thought, and it all rolled together, just rolled together and rolled over him. There were these things to do. Chapter 12. The fish spear didn't work. He stood in the shallows and waited, again and again. The small fish came closer and closer, and he lunged time after time, but was always too slow. He tried jabbing it, throwing it, everything but flailing with it, and it didn't work. The fish were just too fast. He'd been so sure, so absolutely certain that it would work the night before. Sitting by the fire, he'd taken the willow and carefully peeled the bark until he had a straight staff about 6 feet long and just under an inch thick at the base, the thickest end. Then, propping up the hatchet in a crack in the rock wall, he'd pulled the head of his spear against it, carving it into a thin piece off each time until a thick end tapered down to a needle point. Still not satisfied, he could not imagine hitting one of the fish with a single point. He carefully used the hatchet to split the point up in the middle for 8 or 10 inches and jammed a piece of wood up into the split to make a 2-pronged spear, with the points about 2 inches apart. It was crude, but it looked effective, and seemed to have good balance when he stood outside the shelter and hefted the spear. He had worked on the fish spear until it had become more than just a tool. He spent hours and hours on it, and now it didn't work. He moved into the shallows and stood, and the fish came to him. Just as before, they swarmed around his legs, but some of them almost 6 inches long. But no matter how he tried, they were too fast. At first he tried throwing it, but that had no chance. As soon as he brought his arm back, well before he threw, the movement frightened them. Next he tried lunging at them, having the spear ready just above the water and thrusting with it. Finally, he actually put the spear in the water and waited until the fish were right in front of it. But still, somehow, he telegraphed his motion before he thrust, and they saw it and flashed away. He needed something to spring the spear forward, some way to make it move faster than the fish, some motive force, a string that snapped, or a bow and arrow, a thin, long arrow with a point in the water, and a bow pulled back so that all he had to do was release the arrow? Yes, that was it. He had to invent the bow and arrow. He almost laughed as he moved out of the water and put his shoes on. The morning sun was getting hot, and he took his shirt off. Maybe that was how it really happened. Way back when some primitive man tried to spear fish and it didn't work, and he invented the bow and arrow. Maybe it was always that way. Discoveries happened because they needed to happen. He'd not eaten anything yet this morning, so he took a moment to dig up the eggs and eat one. Then he reburied them, banked the fire with a couple of thicker pieces of wood, settled the hatchet on his belt and took the spear in his right hand and set off up the lake to find wood to make a bow. He went without a shirt, but something about the wood smoke smell on him kept the insects from bothering him as he walked to the berry patch. The raspberries were starting to become overripe just in 2 days, and he would have to pick as many as possible after he found the wood, but he did take a little time to pick a few and eat them. They were full and sweet, and when he picked one, 2 others would fall off the limbs into the grass, and soon his hands and cheeks were covered in red berry juice, and he was full. That surprised him, being full. He hadn't thought he would ever be full again. Knew only the hunger, and here he was full. 1 turtle egg and a few handfuls of berries, and he was full. He looked down at his stomach and saw that it was still caved in. It didn't bulge out as it would have with 2 hamburgers and a freezy slush. It must have shrunk, and there was still hunger there, but not like it was, not tearing at him. This was hunger that he knew would be there always, even when he had food, a hunger that made him look for things, see things, a hunger to make him hunt. He swung his eyes toward the berries to make sure the bear wasn't there at his back. Then he moved down to the lake. The spear went out before him automatically, moving the brush away from his face as he walked, and when he came to the water's edge, he swung left. Not sure what he was looking for, not knowing what wood might be the best for a bow. He never made a bow, never shot a bow in his life, but it seemed that it would be along the lake, near the water. He saw some young birch, and they were springy, but they lacked snap somehow, as did the willows, not enough whip back. Halfway up the lake, just as he started to step over a log, he was absolutely terrified by an explosion under his feet. Something like a feathered bomb blew up and away in a flurry of leaves and thunder. It frightened him so badly that he fell back and down, and then it was gone, leaving only an image in his mind. A bird, it had been, about the size of a very small chicken, only with a fantail and stubby wings that slammed against its body and made loud noise. Noise there and gone. He got up and brushed himself off. The bird had been speckled, brown and gray, and it had not been very smart because Brian's foot had been nearly on it before it flew. Half a second more, and he would have stepped on it. And caught it, he thought, and eaten it. He might have been able to catch one, or spear one. Maybe, he thought, maybe it tasted like chicken. Maybe he could catch one and spear one, and it probably did taste just like chicken. Just like chicken when his mother baked it in the oven with garlic and salt, and it turned golden brown and crackled. He shook his head to drive the picture out and moved down to the shore. There was a tree there with long branches that seemed straight, and when he pulled on one of them and let go, it had the most vicious snap to it. He picked one of the limbs that seemed right, and he began chopping where the limb joined the tree. The wood was hard, and he didn't want to cause it to split, so he took his time, took small chips, and concentrated so hard that at first he didn't hear it. A persistent whine, like the insects, only more steady, with an edge of a roar to it, was in his ears, and he chopped and cut and was thinking of a bow, how he would make a bow, how it would be when he shaped it with the hatchet, and still the sound did not cut through until his limb was nearly off the tree and the whine was inside his head, and he knew it then. A plane. It was a motor, far off, but seeming to get louder. They were coming for him. He threw down the limb and his spear, and holding the hatchet, he started to run for camp. He had to get the fire and up to the bluff and signal to them, get fire and smoke up. He put all of his life into his legs, jumped logs and moved through brush as light as a ghost, swiveling and running, his lungs filling and blowing, and now the sound was louder, coming in his direction. If not right at him, at least closer. He couldn't see it. He could see it all in his mind now, the picture, the way it would be. He would get the fire going, and the plane would see the smoke, then circle and circle once, and then again, and waggle its wings. It would be a float plane, and it would land on the water, and when it would come across the lake, and the pilot would be amazed that he was alive after all these days. All this he saw as he ran for the camp and the fire. They would take him right here, and this very night, he would sit with his father and eat and tell him all the things. He could see it now. Oh yes, as he ran in the sun, his legs liquid springs, he got to the camp, still hearing the whine of the engine, and one stick of wood still had good flame. He dove inside and grabbed the wood and ran around the edge of the ridge, scrambled up like a cat and blew, and nearly had a flame feeding, growing, when the sound moved away. It was abrupt, as if the plane had turned. He shielded the sun from his eyes and tried to see it, tried to make the plane become real in his eyes, but the trees were so high, so thick, and now the sound was still fainter. He kneeled again to the flames and blew and added grass and chips to the flames, fed and grew, and in moments he had a bonfire as high as his head, but the sound was gone now. Look back, he thought. Look back and see the smoke now, and turn, please turn. Look back, he whispered, feeling all the pictures fade, seeing his father's face fade like the sound, like lost dreams, like an end to hope. Oh, turn now and come back. Look back and see the smoke and turn for me. But it kept moving away until he could not hear it, even in his imagination, in his soul. Gone. He stood on the bluff over the lake, his face cooking in the roaring bonfire, watching the clouds of ash and smoke going into the sky, and thought, no more than thought. He knew then that he would not get out of this place. Not now, not ever. That had been a search plane. He was sure of it. That must have been them, and they had come as far off to the side of the flight plan as they thought they would have to come, and then turned back. They did not see his smoke, did not hear the cry from his mind. They would not return. He would never leave now, never get out of here. He went down to his knees and felt the tears start, cutting through the smoke and ash on his face, silently falling onto the stone. Gone, he thought. Finally, it was all gone. All silly and gone. No bows, no spears, no fish or berries. It was all silly anyway, all just a game. He could do a day, but not forever. He could not make it if they did not come for him today, someday. He could not play the game without hope. He could not play the game without a dream. They had taken it all away from him now. They'd turned away from him, and there was nothing for him now. The plane, gone. His family, gone. All of it gone. They would not come. He was alone, and there was nothing for him.